Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today we're talking about the Commerce Clause, and there are actually lots of cases we'll be talking about today. We have Dr. Beinberg back with us. Dr. Beinberg, we're going to start with chickens and wheat with the Commerce Clause. So what do chickens and wheat have to do with anything in the Constitution?
Right. So just worth reviewing, since it's been, I think, many episodes since we did some of the earlier commerce cases and Federalist 45 and 39, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So under one of the major switches of the U.S. Constitution from the Articles of Confederation is, again, federal government has its own enforcement powers, but it has a few additional enumerated powers. And one of them is the power to regulate commerce among the states, which, if you were to sort of apply how the word among is meaning has shifted, is commerce between the states, would be sort of how we would write that today. And so there's cases in the Gibbons and McCulloch v. Maryland and others we've talked about before, about sort of how connected does an implementation power have to be to enforcing interstate commerce. But that's sort of what we're working with. In 1935, basically, in the case called the Schechter Poultry versus United States, Congress during the Depression had given massive regulatory powers to the president. I'm being a little glib, but it's effectively, president, fix the economy, go. And so the administration issues various rules trying to sort of tweak the supply and demand of various goods in order to sort of regulate their way out of the Depression. And one of these is part of the National Recovery Act, and it effectively, the president creates a rule for the purchasing of various goods, and one of which is this weird rule where you basically have to buy whatever chicken you get. You don't get to pick the chicken. And so there's this local poultry dealer that wants to let their customers sort of poke their head in the coop and pick the chicken. And this is illegal under this federal Great Depression fighting policy that Franklin Roosevelt has dictated. Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court and the Schechter brothers say, look, if we were shipping a chicken to New Jersey, you could certainly regulate that. If we're buying a chicken from Pennsylvania, you can regulate that. But a customer basically walking up to our local, effectively poultry dealer, for the younger folks, this is effectively just a grocery store that's only selling meat, this one kind of meat. That's not interstate commerce. It's commerce, yes, but it's not interstate commerce. And the Commerce Clause requires both parts. And the Supreme Court, by a 9-0 opinion, agrees and says, if we let the federal government regulate this, this would be meaningfully the destruction of our federal system of government, where most power is left with the states and the federal government has distinct particular responsibilities and powers. And Charles Evans Hughes writes this. It's, again, a unanimous opinion. Even the more progressive justices that tend to have a slightly more expansive vision of federal power think this is crazy. There are, again, some progressive justices that are very states' rightsy. One of them is Louis Brandeis. And Brandeis is like the big hero of the New Deal people. And he doesn't write in the case itself, but he assembles the New Deal lawyer sort of people and says, go home, do this kind of stuff at the states. There's no constitutional authority for the federal government to micromanage basically even local commercial transactions. So we get a 9-0 case in 1935 saying the federal government cannot regulate you like walking into a store and buying a chicken. That is commerce, yes. Interstate, no. Jump ahead 7 years. By this point, Franklin Roosevelt has appointed pretty much the entirety of the Supreme Court. And one of the things that he has used is he wants justices who have a more expansive interpretation of the Commerce Clause. Some of his advisors had said, look, why don't we just go for a constitutional amendment? We've basically wiped the Republican Party out in both Congress and in the states. We will have no problem getting an amendment ratified saying Congress can regulate basically all commerce, right? You could basically take the interstate out, or Congress can regulate wages and hours and purchasing, whatever specific powers you think needs to get added. Roosevelt just says, look, it's just going to be cleaner to just say commerce is much more expansive. And so in 1942, a case called Wickard versus Filburn comes down. And in this case, the Agricultural Adjustment Act basically puts a quota on how much grain can get produced because they want to reduce the production to therefore increase the demand is sort of what the theory is going to be. Or I guess technically shift the demand curve to the side, but the demand will be fixed. And so there's a guy who's growing grain on his farm and feeding it to his animals on his farm, and he gets prosecuted for breaking the quotas. And he says, look, it's not commerce. I didn't buy it. I didn't sell it. And it's not interstate. It never even left my farm, much less, being sold across state lines. And you have to basically have both of these two provisions for the Commerce Clause to be relevant here. And originally actually in the oral or the sort of internal discussions, a majority of the court was going to strike this down. Justice Roberts, who was the only remaining justice from the previous time, by this point, basically thinks this is crazy. And he's got a majority with him. But they hear it as a re-argument and they re-hear it again. And by this time, Roberts basically realizes he's going to lose. And so he just sort of throws his hands up in the air. But now we have not a 9-0 case saying you can't regulate local chickens, a 9-0 case saying, yes, we recognize this guy isn't buying or selling this grain. And yes, we recognize it's never leaving his farm. But if every single person in the United States aggregated up, made a decision like that, that would modify the macroeconomic demands for various goods in interstate commerce. And therefore, the federal government can regulate that. I mean, this is literally the argument that people have been mocking for decades, saying that you could create an endless causal chain of this, then this, then this, then this, then this, means that it's interstate commerce. But by a 9-0 case, the Supreme Court says that's fine. As I tell my students, if you like this case, great. If you don't like this case, I have bad news. Almost every single thing that the federal government does today comes from the authorization of this Supreme Court case. And there's another one on the taxing side that effectively retreats that expansively too that we talked about in another session. So for decades, the Supreme Court, anytime Congress would do something and they would challenge it on federalism grounds, they would just say, see Wickard v. Filburn, see Wickard v. Filburn, see Wickard v. Filburn. So that anything that in the aggregate could be said to sort of indirectly affect interstate commerce is considered something that the federal government can regulate. So massive, massive expansion of federal power. This is criticized by sort of old school constitutionalists that think, no, that the court was right in Schechter. This is inconsistent with Commerce Clause. Probably the sort of leading sort of protester on this in the coming decades is Barry Goldwater, the Arizona senator, and sort of his political clique of Arizonans. In the 1970s and 80s, he is able to get two of them on the Supreme Court, William Rehnquist and Sandra Day O'Connor, who are both very, very committed to federalism. And Rehnquist clearly hates the Wickard case. He's been seething about it evidently for a long time. And he's been writing various dissents saying the Commerce Clause has been just totally distorted. In 1995, he now, as a result of appointees he now has effectively a majority of justices that think that the Commerce Clause has just gone too far. And so this brings us to the 1995 case, U.S. v. Lopez. And in U.S. v. Lopez, a kid is basically prosecuted for a federal gun possession charge. Again, emphasize, federal gun possession charge. Nobody contests that the state government could say you can't bring a gun onto a school zone or onto a school. Certainly the grounds. The zone gets a little fuzzier, but the grounds itself. Absolutely, state police powers, health, welfare, safety, and morals. But what lets the federal government ban possession? And it's justified under the Commerce Clause. And Rehnquist says, effectively, look, Wickard was a terrible decision. He's not quite that blunt about it, but if you're translating, you can see that's what he says. Wickard is terrible. It massively expanded federal power, but we can at least, in the world of a much more integrated economy, basically, we will spot you the interstate. So we will say that Congress can just effectively regulate commerce, whether it's interstate or in-state locally. But it has to be fundamentally about economics and commercial. You can't use commerce as a pretext for health laws, as a pretext for safety laws, as a pretext for other things that are left within the purview of the states. And so in this case, Rehnquist says, this kid's got a gun in schools. That's a safety thing. That's a state criminal law thing. The federal government has no authority to do this. Justice Clarence Thomas writes a concurring opinion saying, yes, even Wickard doesn't say you can regulate literally anything, but it has to be about like goods and production and sales and something. But he says, nonetheless, Wickard still is terrible. We should overturn it. Nobody else joins that opinion. Clarence Thomas, every Commerce Clause case since then basically says, and Wickard is terrible. We should overturn it. The dissents under Stephen Breyer and David Souter effectively say, yes, but this may not directly look like commerce, but if kids are fearful that there are guns in schools, they'll sort of be unnerved. They'll learn less. If they learn less, they won't do as well. They won't go to college. They won't make as much money. And therefore, that will affect, at the macro level, interstate commerce, which Rehnquist basically says proves his point, that if you can create this sort of endless causal loop, that the federal government can basically be said to be able to do anything it wants if, 7 hops down the line, it affects interstate commerce. So Lopez stands for basically the principle that the federal government is indeed one of enumerated powers. It can regulate commerce, even if it's not interstate, but it can't use commerce as a way to regulate basically regular criminal law. There's a couple cases afterward. One of them, as I tell my students, is why I'm sort of damned to be a law professor, because I was in college when this one came down, which is Gonzales v. Raich, which is effectively little old lady has a California marijuana license. She's growing and smoking marijuana in her house, and the federal DEA comes after her, saying it's interstate commerce. And she says basically the same stuff that Wickard did, which is, look, that Filburn did, I should say, in the Wickard case. I'm not buying it. I'm not selling it. I'm growing it in my house. I'm smoking it in my house. It's not interstate. It's not commerce. And again, Clarence Thomas says, yep, this is ridiculous. Wickard is stupid. Overturn it. Rehnquist, who's dying at this point, and O'Connor writes an opinion joined by Rehnquist saying this clearly exceeds interstate commerce. Scalia and Kennedy actually flip, interestingly, and they say, we think both Wickard and Lopez are fine. We think this case looks more like Wickard than like Lopez, because we don't think this is basically a criminal sort of morals law. We think this is about suppressing a market for a good. We think the federal government has the Commerce Clause authority to suppress marijuana as a product, as commerce. So they don't say Lopez is wrong. They just say this one looks more like Wickard than like Lopez. Rehnquist and O'Connor will say this looks more like Lopez. So that doesn't change the doctrine in a sense, but it suggests that the court is not, as a majority, strictly reading the Commerce Clause, strictly reading that case. And then jumping ahead to the Sebelius case in 2012, NFIB versus Sebelius. This was whether the so-called individual mandate of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, as more popularly known, which basically imposes a fine if you don't purchase health insurance. And this gets challenged as a violation of the Commerce Clause. And a majority of the court actually agrees with that, with an asterisk. The majority of the court says, yes, the Commerce Clause cannot be used to basically create its own commerce, to force commerce where it doesn't exist. Not purchasing a good is not a commercial action. But John Roberts says, nonetheless, we can instead think of this as it's a tax. And so he's willing to uphold the individual mandate as a tax because it's just a financial penalty and therefore you go to prison or something like that. And the dissent squabbles about that and says, look at where it is in the law and how it's structured. This is not a tax. This is a criminal penalty. And so you can't use the tax power for this. The interesting thing in this case is that actually Anthony Kennedy, who's often thought of as the moderate of the era, is actually the one who's the most vocal. And apparently their accounts afterward are that he's like in John Roberts' office screaming at him for days. They have to, after Roberts flips. Originally, he's going to strike the mandate on commerce grounds. And then he flips, and Kennedy supposedly is like camped out in Roberts' office, like bellowing at him. It's not Scalia, it's not Thomas, it's Kennedy of all people who's bellowing at him.
Interesting.
So there's all sorts of fun backstory you can read. The journalist Jan Crawford has written sort of about this kind of stuff. So the takeaway from sort of the sweep of this is the federal government can regulate basically anything that's commercial. It can't regulate stuff that is not fundamentally commercial. Now, that being said, the court has been very, very reluctant to sort of apply Lopez. In fact, literally, Congress repasses the No Guns in Schools Act, which I always feel bad if you're a member of Congress. You can't vote against that, even if you think it's unconstitutional. Yeah. You're going to get crucified in an ad, right? It's going to have like sirens and scary lights and like sounds of gunshots and crying children. You can't vote against that politically. And so they repass it and basically say, Congress, believing this affects interstate commerce because the gun probably moved across the state line somewhere, and rather than say like, come on, this is a pretext. The Supreme Court let that stand. And so literally a couple of days ago, I was even reading an article saying Lopez officially stands for this really, really strict doctrine, not really strict, but it's not pre-Wickard, but this fairly clear rule that Congress can't regulate health, welfare, safety, morals. But the court really hasn't wanted to implement that. So functionally speaking, we're still closer to the Wickard world, where as long as Congress can sort of see seven hops and call it commerce, the federal government can regulate it. So they are closer to sort of police powers of the states than I think the sort of, certainly the original understanding of a much more limited commerce power. It's certainly don't worry about the interstate, but the commerce link itself is I think, not particularly rigorously enforced. For better or worse.
It's just an interesting, especially when we talk about US v. Lopez, it's interesting to think about how the Supreme Court ruled, right? They're not saying that you can't have the law. It just doesn't really fit under the Commerce Clause. But my students always loved the Wickard case because, again, it does feel like, no, this is my farm. But when you talk about it changing,
so when I loved it, you mean they hated it?
Yeah. They loved it because they loved the story of it. Yeah. And they were incensed by it because, again, it does. It's like, this is my farm. I'm feeding my livestock. But the decision that, it actually could affect, if more people did it, it could affect the supply and demand. And we're trying to kind of regulate that in the economy. I feel like, I very much enjoy Supreme Court. I enjoy constitutional law. And I think you're not supposed to have favorites, but the Commerce Clause for me is just so interesting because of how it's been looked at throughout history.
It's my favorite, and I've joked that the day that I never want to give up if I have to miss a class is the Commerce Clause day. And in our introductory CEL 200 class, I definitely strong-arm my colleagues to make sure there's a day where we go through Schechter, Wickard, and Raich at least. So, and yeah, I think, and as you said, this is the one that students get excited about. Although I think I've probably observed like 95% of students walk out irate at Wickard. I can't say they're wrong. I have sympathies that way myself, but it is really striking that it is really striking. But it does show the importance, certainly, of constitutional law. And again, for folks that are critical of Wickard, which again I think is quite defensible, the court doesn't necessarily get every one of them right.
Exactly. And that's the nice thing is that they're not supposed to get them all right. And that's why there's checks and balances. And this is why we're doing this entire podcast series. So I'm kind of sad because this is actually our last in our Supreme Court cases. However, in kind of our next semester, if you will, we are getting into American history. We'll still be talking about constitutional law. So Dr. Beinberg, thank you so much. And our next episode is actually on Christmas Day, and then the one after that is on New Year's Day and why they are considered civic holidays. And then we jump into a whole new section of political parties. So thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to our next chunk of podcasts.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.